With the release of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, we now have 5 total MCU trilogies, so I figured it'd be a great time for me to rank all of the MCU trilogies from the worst to the best. Of course, this is just my opinion. I'd love to see your ranking. Drop a comment below with your ranking. And this is kind of going by several different criteria. One of them being just the overall quality of all 3 of the movies in the trilogy, the average quality. And another one being the overall consistency and cohesiveness of the trilogy, how consistent the tone is, the character arcs, and the story. So taking all those things into consideration, this is how we ended up ranking all 5 of the MCU trilogies. And I'm not going to include anything that has more than 3 movies. Thor is no longer a trilogy, and Avengers movies are not a trilogy. This is only the trilogies that are only 3 movies. So there's exactly 5 of them. And number 5 for me is going to be the Iron Man trilogy. Now, the first Iron Man movie is phenomenal. It is still a top 10 MCU movie to me. Endlessly rewatchable. Downey Jr. was perfectly cast in this role, and he is so likable and charismatic in the movie. Every character he interacts with, he elevates them. The dialogue, even though it wasn't even fully written while they were filming this, feels so natural, maybe because of that, but all these character interactions are so good. The humor is so well timed. The movie is so well paced. I love the origin story of Iron Man and how Tony realizes that what he's doing is bad and then needs to stop doing it, needs to help people instead of allowing his weapons to kill innocent people. I think that's a great arc for him that kind of continues on into the other movies, but also works just in and of this movie. I love his relationship with Pepper. I like Rhodey. There's some fun action in here, cool soundtrack. Obadiah Stane, I think, is a really good villain. I don't love the third act. That's about my only problem with the movie. I think he goes out too quickly. I kind of wish that he had carried into the second one. Speaking of the second one, the next 2 Iron Man movies take a significant step down from the first one, and that is why the Iron Man trilogy is last place for me. The second one, I think, has some fun stuff in it. I think that Downey is still phenomenal in the role, and he's maybe at his Tony Starkiest in this one. The dialogue with him is awesome, and there's some fun, interesting stuff in here. However, there is way too many plot lines. I mean, you got the stuff with Whiplash, you got Justin Hammer, you got Tony and his daddy issues, you got Tony trying to figure out how to solve the problem with his arc reactor and his heart, and coming up with the new element, and you have the Avengers setup movie. It's very well known that Favreau was only given 2 years to write and shoot and get this one out when he really wanted 3, but they had to rush into the Avengers, and you can tell that this movie was rushed, and they were trying to set up an Avengers movie with the Nick Fury and Natasha stuff. There's just entirely way too much going on in this one that it feels so clunky. And then you get to Iron Man 3, which gets off to a decent start, and it certainly has some good humor in there. I like Shane Black's writing, and I think it meshes very well with the character of Tony Stark and Downey Jr.'s comedic delivery. And then there's also some pretty interesting stuff where they tackle the ideas of PTSD and mental illness. However, once the Mandarin twist happens, it goes completely off the rails to me, because you trade in a potential very compelling villain in the Mandarin, intimidating, cool villain, and you trade him in for a very generic one in Killian, played by Guy Pearce, who I like Guy Pearce. Incredibly generic and forgettable villain. And then he kidnaps the vice president for reasons, and I'm not a fan of Super Pepper or honestly any of the extremist stuff. So it's a movie that has some interesting ideas in it. It's got some humor. I like some of the Shane Black writing, but the Mandarin twist happens, which just really pissed me off. And then just nothing after that worked for me whatsoever. So the fact that Iron Man 2 and 3 are 2 of my least favorite movies in the MCU really dragged down this trilogy, despite the fact that I'm a big fan of the first one. And number 4 is going to be the AntMan Trilogy. This one, I mean, I enjoy the first one. It is a very fun heist movie within the MCU. Paul Rudd was very well cast. Great humor. It's a fun origin story to where he realizes that he can be more than just a criminal who steals things, and it's a good character arc for him. And then you get into Ant-Man and the Wasp, when Hope gets some more action, and there's some really fun stuff in there as well. Humor lands again. But then you get to Quantumania, where we were supposed to get this epic movie, this epic start to Phase 5, introduction to Kang, and Jonathan Majors was really, really good. Don't get me wrong, and I think he actually elevated the character on paper to where he actually came out better on screen than he was written. And there's some fun, like, sci-fi visuals and action in there, and some good humor. However, I had a big problem with the balancing of the tone, something I talk about a lot with MCU. They did a really poor job of it in this one. My biggest issue is MODOK. MODOK seems like a character that is straight out of like a parody of an MCU movie, and you put him in the same scene as super serious, intimidating, threatening villain and Kang, and it just completely pulls me out of the movie. By far my biggest issue. And along with that, it doesn't really have any stakes. I mean, the movie basically ends exactly where it started and doesn't feel nearly as necessary. It doesn't feel like the epic kickoff to Phase 5 that it was supposed to, because Kang is still trapped in the quantum realm. I don't think he's dead. And none of our heroes die. So it's like, man, really, what was the point of all this? This was supposed to be this high stakes, like high consequences movie to kick off Phase 5 and introduce us to the next big villain, and it wasn't. So it just kind of left me feeling a little bit empty. Now, depending on where they go with that, it could go up on or not on rewatch, but as other movies come out and seeing where they go with Kang, that could elevate this one a little bit. But as of right now, this is where I have it. And I don't think that this movie is going to move on my placement anyway, because coming in at number 3 is going to be the Spider-Man Trilogy. And this is one to where I think the first 2 Spider-Man movies in the MCU are good. Not super memorable. They don't stand out that much in the MCU, and they're not like top 10 or anything. They're not super high stakes. I enjoy Homecoming. I think that Keaton is definitely the best part of the movie, and the twist that he is Liz's dad is great. But aside from that, it's just kind of a typical, safe, like fun high school movie that takes place in the MCU. The action isn't great. The stakes are not high at all. Third act wasn't that good. And I'm not a big fan of the Iron Man Jr. stuff that they do with Peter in this movie. Far From Home I like as well, but also have some issues with. My biggest one by far is the idea that Tony would give these glasses with all these really dangerous capabilities to this 15-year-old kid who he thought was dead at the time. Like, that's the inciting incident of the movie. That's like what kicks off the whole plot, and I just have a hard time getting past that. Some of the humor wasn't great or well-timed. A lot of the humor did work. Some fun action. I think the action took a huge step up in Far From Home compared to Homecoming. I like Mysterio as a villain, and there's definitely some cool visuals involving him, some of the coolest visuals in the entire MCU, but easily the best movie of the trilogy, and the only one that I would consider like a great or elite MCU movie is No Way Home. Despite having some issues with the setup about how everything comes to be, like Peter being dumb, fine, fair enough. But Doctor Strange being so stupid, I mean, this is an adult sorcerer who has incredible responsibilities, and he decides to just start doing this spell without talking to Peter about the parameters of the spell beforehand, and leaves him in the room while he does it. And I had such a hard time buying that. That's something that I will never be able to get past. However, everything after that, after the weird setup, everything that happens after that is phenomenal. I love seeing all the villains, and especially Willem Dafoe as Green Goblin. He is absolutely excellent in this movie, and when he makes the switch from just regular Norman Osborn to Green Goblin, Dafoe plays that perfectly, and you get chills just watching that scene. And the way they do the spider senses stuff, probably the best use of spider senses in any Spider-Man movie, and where Jamie Foxx's Electro is he's so close to finishing the thing to cure him, but then he takes it off at the last second. Such an intense scene. Again, Aunt May dying at the hands of Green Goblin. Then you get the introduction of Garfield Spider-Man and Tobey Spider-Man once again, which is just an absolutely epic moment. I mean, everyone in the theater clapped when that happened. So cool. And it wasn't just a gimmick. It wasn't just to have them in there to say hi for fan service. They actually had a place in the story, and they kind of reminded Peter of who he is, and their interactions with each other, both humorous and serious, were phenomenal.
I love you guys. Thank you.
such good stuff when they're just hanging out before all the villains get there. Maybe some of the best stuff in the entire movie, and they're literally just standing there talking to each other about how their powers work and their past experiences and stuff. And then the villains get there, and it's an incredibly awesome third act, and Peter fights Green Goblin hand to hand. So much awesome stuff in this one, and then ultimately making the decision to make everyone forget about him, making that sacrifice, and then the scene with MJ at the end. So much to love about No Way Home, but because the first two MCU Spider-Man movies just to me are not that great, they're just good, that is the reason the Spider-Man trilogy comes in at number 3. At number 2, I have the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy. Now, this one I think you can say has the most consistent story and character arcs. It feels like the most cohesive trilogy, but because Guardians 2 has a lot of issues for me, I don't think they balance the tone very well. There wasn't much of a central conflict or sense of momentum through a good portion of the movie. I'm not a fan of the villains, even though it maintained the heart of the first movie. A lot of the comedy did work. I loved everything with Yondu. This is the reason that it's not number 1. I love Guardians 1. Phenomenal introduction to these characters. They got you to care about them in such a short amount of time. The I am Groot, the we are Groot moment is absolutely heartbreaking. And the soundtrack is awesome. It's a very vibrant, fast-paced movie with great humor, fun action, great characters. Again, not the greatest villains. Then you have Guardians 3, which is an super emotionally satisfying conclusion to the trilogy, to where every character has their character arc fulfilled and has a satisfying payoff. You have the absolutely tragic and emotional and heartbreaking backstory of Rocket that makes you care about his friends that end up dying, which is an incredibly heartbreaking scene, and then gets you to absolutely hate the High Evolutionary and feel so satisfied when he gets defeated. Again, soundtrack isn't amazing. I think that Guardians 1 by far and away did the soundtrack the best, although there are a couple song placements in Guardians 3 that were so awesome, such as No Sleep Till Brooklyn and Dog Days Are Over. So great stuff in here for sure, but I think that the fact that Guardians 2 has the issues that it does keeps it from being number 1, despite the fact that it is definitely the most cohesive trilogy. And at number 1, I have the Captain America trilogy. Now, this one is definitely not the most cohesive. Now, these movies all kind of feel like their own thing, to where they're definitely all Captain America movies, but there isn't much of a through line story-wise between the three movies. They very much feel like isolated films of their own. However, Winter Soldier and Civil War are just so damn good that makes up for the lack of cohesion. Now, it was very difficult to decide between Captain America and Guardians to be my number 1 trilogy for that exact reason, but just Winter Soldier and Civil War are 2 of my top 3 MCU movies, and I enjoy First Avenger. It's probably towards the bottom of my MCU ranking, but it is still quite good. It's a fun period piece, despite I don't love the fact that they montage through World War II, but it's a great origin story for Captain America, introducing us to his morals, and then we get to Winter Soldier, where his morals very much get tested, and he gets unfrozen in a very different time to where things aren't so black and white anymore. The government is not just the good guy, and S.H.I.E.L.D. has been infiltrated by Hydra this entire time, so he kind of has to learn new things and learn about the new era, and it's really interesting for his character arc that ultimately leads into Civil War. The action in Winter Soldier is probably some of the best hand-to-hand action in the entire MCU. I think that Alexander Pierce and Bucky are both great villains. I think Alexander Pierce as the mastermind villain and Bucky Winter Soldier as the soldier villain. I think that all the stuff with Natasha and Sam in this movie were very good as well. Perfect sidekicks. I think they were utilized perfectly in this movie to where they felt like necessary inclusions and great additions to the cast, but Captain America was still clearly the main character. It's just a very intriguing spy thriller with great action and adds a ton of depth to Captain America's character. Then you get to Civil War, to where stuff that transpires in Winter Soldier and Age of Ultron leads to Captain America taking the side that he does in Civil War, which makes a ton of sense given everything the character has gone through. Then you have Tony, who's on the opposite end, and it's funny because if this movie had taken place 5 years prior, they'd be switched. But because Captain America going through everything he did with S.H.I.E.L.D. and Hydra coming to distrusts the government, it makes sense that he doesn't want to be put under government oversight. Tony, realizing that he is too dangerous for his own good and needs to be put in check. Now he ends up being the one who is in support of government oversight. I think that is great, and their discussions about it are so good. They both make really good points, and I wouldn't begrudge anyone for taking either side. I'm personally Team Cap, but Team Tony makes some really good points as well. There's some great action in this one. The airport fight is awesome. I think that the fight between Steve, Tony, and Bucky at the end is great as well, because it is incredibly personal. The reveal that Bucky killed Tony's parents is a great reveal that gives me chills every time I watch it, and you understand, once again, why Tony's acting the way that he did. Zemo, I think, is a very underrated villain, to where people say he's not even necessary to the story. Bullshit. He's the one pulling the strings from behind the scenes and manipulates everything to get things to play out exactly the way he wants to. He makes the Avengers break up. He wins without having to lift a finger. And that's ultimately, despite the fact that nobody dies, which people will say, oh, this movie doesn't have any stakes because nobody dies. The stakes are that the Avengers break up, which ultimately leads to them losing in Infinity War, and then ultimately leads to them having to bring everyone back in Endgame, which leads to Tony and Natasha's death. So you can't tell me there is no stakes in here. The stakes aren't necessarily felt in this one, but it leads to things that happen in later on in the MCU, which I think is kind of a testament. That's kind of the case with this entire trilogy, to where, again, it's not as cohesive of a trilogy. You can't just watch all three movies in a row like you can with the Guardians movies, and it doesn't work as well when you do that. You kind of have to watch them within the larger context of the MCU. But because Winter Soldier and Civil War are just that good, that elevates the Captain America trilogy to number one for me. You also get the introduction to Spider-Man and Black Panther, so just phenomenal. Winter Soldier and Civil War are excellent movies. That's the reason the Captain America trilogy is number one. But it was tough because of how good the Guardians movies are and because of how cohesive that trilogy is. I went back and forth on that, but I ultimately had to decide that the Captain America trilogy was number one. So hopefully my reasoning made sense. And again, this is just my opinion. So drop your list below, your ranking of the 5 MCU trilogies, and we'll start a conversation about it. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. Likes are super important for helping push my videos out to more people, helping me grow my channel. If you enjoy my content in general, subscribe, hit the notification bell, get notified when I post a video. Stay tuned. I got a lot more content coming. I will see you soon.